Martin Kelman, École des Ponts Business School, Director of Executive Education.
I'm Rial Miller from UNESCO. I'm Head of Futures Literacy. Futures literacy is a capability. It's the capacity to use the future. What's interesting is that we actually use the future all the time. People don't do anything without using the future. But we don't think very often about why we use it and how we use it. So futures literacy is really providing people with an insight into the way the future is created in their own minds and in their community. Now, the future can only be imaginary because nobody can go there. So the future has to be imagined. So really this is about how people use their imagination. And so what we do with futures literacy is help people to sort of see that the ideas of the future, the things they hope for, the things that they're frightened of, are things that they've created in their own minds. And to ask the question, where do those things come from? Where do those ideas come from? And if I can change those ideas, how does it change what I see and what I do? Because the future actually has a huge impact on the way we perceive the world around us and the choices that we make. Perception and choice are not the same thing. Futures literacy helps us to distinguish all those different aspects of the way in which the future enters into daily life.
Financial services industry has traditionally played a really important role in determining the future, in fact, in giving a value to the future. Because after all, what does a bank do and what do banks do in general is they're guarantors of value over time. That is a fundamental role of the future in the present, and allocation through valuating assets, property, businesses from one to the other. So the financial sector and futures literacy are intimately related because the system we're in today is clearly at a crisis point. What got us here is probably not the system that's going to get us to the next phase, whatever that phase may be. And so we need to be able to project ourselves today and to understand what are the underlying bedrock foundational assumptions that we use today and that we will have to challenge. Because just drawing a line and saying, having different scenarios, different forecasts, saying, well, this is where we're going today, or this is where we are today, this is where we may be tomorrow, is not going to be enough to actually face the challenges we are today. And so we're working together and with various financial institutions to precisely see how this capability of using the future can help us think differently, can help us challenge the underlying assumptions that we actually use today.
Yeah. There are a lot of embedded systems for imagining the future. The interest rate, the discount rate is an obvious example. Those are the artifacts, those are the product of history and a lot of experimentation. Nobody knew in advance that there would be central banks to try and assure continuity over time and therefore deal with the temporal nature of assets. Central banks got invented, currencies became stable or less stable. All of those things are ways of thinking about the future. And in Ireland just the other day, Martin and I were there, and we were thinking about climate change and the issue of how you begin to, in some senses, how the financial sector can begin to take responsibility for the world around us from the point of view of not just adaptation, not just mitigation, which are very important from the point of view of reducing the impact, for instance, of carbon and of climate change, the warming of the world, but also transformation. And transformation, which is close to innovation, and which has some relationship, I think, to the kind of hackathon that you're talking about, is, do I just hack what's going on already and make it better? Do I hack something because it's there, meaning it's already there, and therefore I can go at it? Or am I hacking myself? am I hacking my own idea? Am I actually breaking out of what I'm thinking in today? And that's partly, I think, what Martin was referring to in that it's not obvious how to do that. And that's, again, where our imagination comes in. And it turns out I travel all around the world. I work with many different countries. And I've identified something which I think is a significant challenge, which is poverty of the imagination, where our imagination isn't really exercised because we're just hacking what already exists, or we're just hacking the future that we already thought about. So that's yesterday's future, or maybe even somebody else's future. I mean, think of the amazing hacks that resulted in Wakanda, in Black Panther. You know, people who've seen Black Panther, they've seen Wakanda. Wakanda's a kind of techno-utopia. Unbelievable technology, wow, fantastic. But it's a linear projection of the past into the future. And maybe that's not the kind of world we want to think about at all. So hacking to get there is actually hacking to get into somebody else's idea of the future. And you're using somebody else's idea of the future. So when it comes to breaking free and letting your mind be open and understanding that there's many things happening around us that you can't even give a name to because your idea of the future limits what you see, is part of what we're talking about. So it's really the diversification. It's not saying one is good and one is better, and that it's that we need to understand that there's a wide range of reasons for using the future and methods for using the future. And that's the foundation for transformation, because it provides us with greater openness and in some senses overcomes the I've got a problem, let's fix it idea, or I'm an engineer, I'm going to determine the future and impose my idea on the future, and rather to say, those are two ways of thinking about the future, but there are other ways of thinking about the future that I don't even know what they're going to be like until I begin to explore. That's transformation. If you know what transformation is before you do it, it's not transformation. It's transformation when, as you're doing it, you say, ooh, this is something completely different. So if you try and plan it, it won't happen. But if you try and be open to creating the imagination and you work your imagination with the world around you, including other people, then you can get there.
And in fact, to build on what Riel is saying, we have studied a lot of the innovation and a lot of the new services and products that banks from all over the world, in fact, because we've actually questioned banks from all over the world to see what their innovation were, how they were integrating inclusion and sustainability into their day-to-day and into their strategy. And the reality is that this poverty of imagination that Riel was talking about is extremely present, to put it mildly. That is, when you actually analyze most of the innovative products, they are merely adaptations of what we've done already, in one way or another. There is very little true out-of-the-box, true quote-unquote disruptive innovation, although everybody claims to be doing disruptive innovation. We're actually only providing more sophisticated or cheaper, if it's when it comes to inclusion, and that's actually quite, how do you say, it's somewhat desolating to think that the only way we've found really in the financial sector to expand inclusion or to incorporate this notion of inclusion is by limiting the services, therefore making them cheaper and therefore more accessible, rather than trying to think differently about, well, what does it mean to be in the system? What does it mean to be given access to the system? And what are the underlying assumptions that challenges? So we're really in that kind of, that's when I believe futures literacy and the work we're doing together with UNESCO can potentially really feed into the hackathon that you guys are also pushing to find new ideas.
Is the financial sector actually one of the key kind of ways in which our societies transform? And I think in many ways, of course, historically, we've seen that it is, because it plays a role in playing things that die, taking away money, taking away investment, and giving investment. And that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens at a societal level. It happens with government. It happens with people and communities and and new industries. And so today, one of the questions becomes is, does the banking sector step up to that role? And there we see, we had a lot of interesting discussions at EFMA in Dublin when we were talking about finance and green finance and climate change, related to the question of what's valuable, what's an asset. And it seems to me that the financial sector can precisely dive into that area and say, let's open up the box of what's valuable. Now, that's very disruptive in the sense that it changes the nature of assets. And of course, assets are what define security, and security and status are asset-based. So if you begin to open up the box of what is an asset, where does value come from, you begin to open up the entire system. But if the banks are not doing that, who's going to do that? In other words, that's their business, really, to be thinking about value in society and how to be allocative, play an allocative role. Including with respect to their clients. What makes a client valuable? Is it just, what they earn? Is it just their bank account? Or are there broader and more inclusive, in that sense, issues? And those are areas of innovation which you really can't get to unless you're willing to suspend the existing system and allow your imagination to think about a world where there are no banks. I mean, it's only a few hundred years that there have been banks. So why can't we imagine a world with no banks? And then say, how does it work? What's it like? What would the technology do in a situation where you weren't serving shareholders, startup venture capitalists, but you were serving another system? How would that function? Now, I'm not giving an answer, but I'm saying that from the point of view of a hackathon, the challenge of inclusion really goes beyond the boundaries of the existing system.
Well, there's a lot of initiatives. Once again, like we said a minute ago, whether it's the Futures Literacy and initiatives we run in Paris, whether it's in Ireland, a lot of these initiatives are incremental and with relatively limited impact. Less than 1% of green funds green funds represent less than 1% of assets under management in Europe. So even though there are lots of new green funds being expanded everywhere, being talked about everywhere, they actually have a very little impact. So despite the fact that there's a lot being done, it's incremental, it's largely built on what exists already, and has yet to have has yet to have significant impact. Okay, that's, I would say, is the starting point. Then, when we open the discussion, when we get the banks, the insurance companies, the financial sector as a whole, to start challenging, like Riel was saying, well, what will our future be in 2050? Let's try to imagine that. What if there are no more banks? What if their assets are no longer property-based, but completely intangible? What if we're having to value trust? What if we're having to value well-being? What if we're having to give a value to and provide transactional capability to a digital identity? How does that work?
Yeah, and multiple avatars. And how do you own the avatar? And how do you make yourself responsible for the avatar? And how does the avatar create a simulated world where you can learn what it's like to break the rules of society, but also the consequences, and therefore internalize some aspects of what it means to be different, what it means to be an outsider, what it means to be taking your own path without having to do it in the real world, but making that something valuable. I mean, I've taken one example that this is a kind of an old one. There was a book that was written about 15 years ago about a drug dealer. And if you read the novel about the drug dealer, he ran a little posse there. You realize that, of course, this is somebody who has unbelievable MBA skills, right? They've got all this master business skills because they can deal with the police, they can deal with the employees, They have supply problems. They have, unbelievable stress, and it's incredible. But do they get credit for it? Do they have a certificate? Do they have status? No, they don't. So there's all sorts of ways that we can think about understanding what the value is of things that we're creating, including caring, including dealing with the environment. And if we break into that kind of a sphere, it opens up all sorts of different avenues for the sector to invent things. But the point that I think one aspect of futures literacy and the work that we've been doing in the banking sector is important to stress is that we're not coming in with answers. And we're not saying that the answers come from only one sector. In other words, part of the point about literacy, okay, so this is reading and writing, is that reading and writing is something that becomes universal. It becomes society-wide. It's the classical thing like a fax machine. If there's only one fax machine, it's not going to use. If there's only one cell phone, it's not of any use. But if everybody has a cell phone, then of course it's very useful. And in this case with futures literacy, when people become aware of how they're using the future and why they're using the future, and they become less frightened by the need for certainty. So we're in a situation today where, and the banking sector encourages this in part, which is, just give me a sure bet. Just something that you can really be absolutely certain of, because anything that's uncertain is bad. Well, the only thing that's certain is uncertainty. So it's a bit of a curious position to put ourselves in opposition to the world around us. And so all of this is kind of interconnected. Outside the banking sector, the whole question of capabilities. I'll just give one little example, that to kind of illustrate the point, is that when people were moving out of the countryside into the city, they learned to read because in the city, it really was important to be able to read the signs, to be able to read the newspaper, to get the job, to be able to read when you're in the factory. And so reading was a crucial component of being at ease and making everything work. Well, of course, that took a long time to happen. Peasants are still coming off the rural in Brazil and in China and all that. That transition is a difficult transition. Today, the world's in a transition as well. And do we have the capabilities and the skills, the ways of thinking that are appropriate to the power of our technology, the nature of our aspirations, valuing diversity, valuing interaction and exchange, creating openness? All of those things are a huge challenge to the existing base of skills that we have and expectations, even around identity. Who am I? How do I construct my identity? Very basic things. But there again, the financial sector is not independent of all that, because oftentimes your bank account is a lot of who you are. And so here again, why not open up the conversation from the banking sector and think about who are we? And actually in Ireland, there was some of that, talking about identity and the nature of what it's like to be Irish.
And that's what I find interesting, is precisely that, is that when you actually involve these actors in this discussion, despite an initial, what's the point? I have my budget to meet, I have a 3-year plan, that's good enough. But suddenly, when you actually open up the discussion, then suddenly all of these questions, these are not our ideas. These ideas all bubble up from the banks, the insurance companies, the startups around the table that are actually, and the individuals therefore, around the table that are actually, once they project themselves into the future and to say, this is the future I want, well, quite naturally, you start asking all of these questions about the past, or about the present rather.
Martin was just referring to that because he was just saying that these ideas come up from the people that we talk to. So maybe, to give you a little bit more sense of the structure, there are many ways to understand the underlying, what we call anticipatory systems. In other words, the ways in which people imagine. There are many ways to understand it, but one way, and this is what we've been doing with businesses, with governments, with around the world, is to get people to work together in what is called a collective intelligence knowledge creation process. And this is a process where we use learning by doing, and we scaffold or accumulate in steps and stages an awareness of different ways of using the future. So this again, I'll take the reading analogy. you need to learn the alphabet before you can create a word. Then you need to understand words to get to a sentence. Then you need a sentence to get to a paragraph, and then you get to a book, and then you get to writing, and then you get to all sorts of other things. So this is the same thing, is that it's a bit unfair, and it happens all the time. I've been doing futures work for more than 35 years. It's a bit unfair to ask people to imagine the future. I go, oh, well, yeah. But of course, people are concerned about the future, so they try. But it makes a big difference to create a kind of learning process where people can go step by step, sharing their ideas together, allowing them to express what they hope for, what they fear, what they expect, what they predict, but also becoming more humble and saying, maybe my predictions, maybe my hopes need to be more open. So for instance, if you think about hopes and things like values, do you want your grandparents' values to be the values that prevail in the future? Well, no, you changed from your grandparents' values. So why project your values on your grandchildren? In other words, do you colonize the future? Do you try and impose your idea of the future on the future? And all of a sudden people step back and they say, oh dear, maybe I shouldn't be trying to impose my idea of the future on the future. Maybe I should be thinking about how the future influences my behavior now. So if you're in favor of mitigation, adaptation, and transformation around climate change, what does that mean now? And your legacy becomes what you do now, not something you try and impose on the future. All of that comes out fairly naturally if you create a structured process where people can work together to think about the future. So these are what we call futures literacy laboratories, and we've been doing them all around the world.
And in a very simple way, maybe for maybe some of the participants in the hackathon to just kind of grasp it, in a very simple way, it just starts by first thinking about a probable future. What do you think is likely to happen? That's quite standard. That's relatively easy for us to do. It's a little bit more difficult when you project yourself 20 or 30 years along, but still that is the normal way of doing things. And suddenly you stop and say, okay, what's the desirable future? And there something starts happening. You start saying fears start, or hopes start emerging. And from there, once you have that's the foundation upon which you can start asking questions and reframing. Just asking about, okay, what are the underlying assumptions? Is the desirable future something that can be somehow created? What do I need to change today if I even hope to get to there? Is it desirable but totally utopian? Or is it desirable but achievable? And so suddenly what happens is that you start playing with ideas, you start confronting your own fears, your own hopes. Since it's also collective, it's also extremely rich because you start listening to what the zeitgeist of the group is. And that's obviously something very interesting because that's where novelty comes from, through diversity, through association. And so suddenly you really start exploring totally new venues, totally new possibilities. It's an extremely enriching process and quite fun, actually.
It has to be fun because it's creative. There has to be trust, and fun and creativity and trust and diversity all go together, and that creates a kind of chemistry, which is partly helps to create new menus, which doesn't mean you necessarily choose what's on the menu, but you create new menus. And partly it opens up this peripheral vision. And there's an important thing from the point of view of experimentation. If we want to encourage more experimentation, which means failure and success, but if we also want to appreciate or take into account the massive amount of experimentation taking place in the world around us, which is not something planned or just decided upon, but just happens, then being able to be creative in this way, to be able to share things, to be able to say, there's really no word for this, what I'm thinking of. Do you have a word for that? This seems like right on the edge of stuff. Do you see that too? I don't know what it means. I don't know where it's going, but maybe it's interesting and we can experiment. It gives you more confidence to experiment. And the fundamental for me, kind of hacker perspective is this willingness to take risks from the point of view of experimentation, and to also appreciate experimentation happening all around us. And futures literacy and using the future differently and doing it with other people provides us with an ability to make sense and make sense of emergence and novelty. So this allows us to be much more experimentalist in our approach. And in that sense, fundamentally, to hack ourselves.
Call to action, yes. Keep thinking forward. Keep hacking yourselves. Because actually one of the things that came out of both Ireland and the EFMA conference here, or the EFMA lab here, is the financial sector today does have a tendency to act more as a guardian of the temple rather than as, well, let's walk outside of the temple and see what new temple, if we have to build a temple at all, we can build. But what is out there? And I think the financial sector clearly has a fundamental role to play there, like it has in the past.
Yeah, it's a big sector, and it's an important sector. It's also a sector that's used to kind of being wrong, but also being right, and taking risks and confronting uncertainty. Part of doing that is to conduct research. Part of that is to increase people's skills. And one of the things that the École de Pont and UNESCO are working on is creating university chairs that give us a possibility to enhance skills, practice, in other words, do experiments, learn by doing, and really advance the kind of connectivity and I'd say fertility of the world around us by linking in different sectors, different activities. And there the banking sector can take a crucial role. Small amount of investment, a small amount of attention from a big sector like the banking sector could create leverage, could be a catalytic kind of impact. And that would be something I think that would also help the banking sector to show that it takes seriously the kind of crises that we're in and its capacity to play a constructive, transformational role. So I think the banking sector has a really important part to play.
Thank you very much.